Hey guys, welcome in. The goal of this video is quite simply to give you a much better understanding of what fugues are, how fugues work, what are some of the features, what can you kind of expect from a piece called fugue. But in this video, I'm not just going to do the typical throw a whole bunch of different ideas, like memorize these 5 or 10 things that fugues do at you, but instead I went through and analyzed all the Well-Tempered Clavier, book 1, all 24 of the fugues in there. I went through and basically made a chart of what we expect from a fugue, the things that we learn about fugues that we typically teach you in these type of videos. But what I did is I went through each fugue and said whether or not that fugue follows the norm. So you can see from the top of the chart here a whole bunch of categories. I will explain each one to you in this video, then also go through some examples of fugues that follow what we expect should happen, and also some fugues that don't, so you can kind of see what an exception looks like. What was also really fun about looking at the fugues in this way is that you can see some aspects are almost universal. Basically, all the Bach fugues will do that, where some things are still common. Everything is still in over half of the fugue, so they're all common, but not close to all of them. And before I jump in, just want to let you know that I have a very deep understanding of fugues, so I'm very qualified to teach you about them. I took a lot of theory classes, both undergraduate and graduate degrees. Love theory, love diving into stuff like this. However, I did make a chart of 24 fugues and filled up a whole bunch of information in different columns of them. So just know the odds of there being a typo are pretty high, or also the odds of I haven't played all 24 of the fugues. Me flipping through them and missing a theme entrance here and there, it might happen, right? So I know there are some of you who have played probably the audience's size each one of these fugues. So if you see something inaccurate, feel free to mention in the comments section. Just also understand the odds of there just simply being a transfer error somewhere along the way is pretty high with a data set this big. So now we're ready to dive into the chart here. And the very first column I did was number of voices. What this basically means is that when you have a voice, you're going to have something like a melody played in one part, okay? And then you're going to do that in another voice, like, and then if you add a third voice, so you have two things doing something different, and you add a third voice, that's going to be a 3-voice fugue. Another way to think about this, if you were to split these fugues up into different instrumentalists, like you gave the highest part to a violin, the second highest part to a viola, and the third highest part to a cello, how many people do you need? Instrumentalists that more play one note at a time. Maybe strings isn't the best example. Maybe a better example would be like woodwinds that are more stuck on just one note. How many would you need to perform the fugue? So the first fugue, Bach says, there are 4 voices. There are 4 different parts happening at the same time. The next one is 3, the next one's 3, the next one's 5. In fact, I just want to bring this up because I think if you ask most of us how many voices the fugues have from Well-Tempered Clavier book 1, we probably would say 3 or 4. And that actually assumption is really accurate. That's one that the general assumption of 3 or 4 voices is spot on. In fact, there are 10 of them with 4 voices, 11 of them with 3 voices. Then there are 2 with 5 voices, which are kind of weird exceptions. Like 5 is pretty rare. And there's one of them with only 2 voices in the first book. And that's also pretty rare. But that's kind of the first thing to notice. Okay, so in general, when you learn the fugues, people say, the Bach fugues have 3 or 4 voices. That's pretty accurate. Most of them have 3 or 4 voices. And then even when you get into things like the toccatas, most of them have 3 or 4 voices. So now we're ready to talk about our first real category. So one of the first things you learned about fugues, one of the things that make it a fugue, is that the voices enter one at a time. So this category I just called enter one at a time, yes or no. So I looked at the fugues and I said, how many of them actually do what we expect? Do they actually enter one voice at a time? Now what that means, we're going to look at the second fugue here in C minor, which if you've studied anything in this category before, this is often used as kind of like the poster boy fugue. Like this is the one that's often taught. You'll see why here in a little bit. But what that means is when the piece starts, it's not going to start like this with harmony. It doesn't. Fugues should rarely start that way. There may be exceptions, but that's not how it's standard at all. What they do is they enter one voice at a time. What that means is you're going to have the full subject, the main melody of the piece, played in just one part. This is our melody. And so this has just one voice, one part. There's no need to like hold multiple things. There's no overlap in the notes. It's just basically something that can be played in just one part, one voice. And this is exactly that. What we're going to have next in this piece is while the first voice continues to play, we're going to add the second subject in a different voice. So in this case, this is going to be the first voice is now going to do something different. In the right hand up here on top, it's going to do our main melody. But we still only have two voices. We haven't added a third one. This fugue actually says three voices. So we're going to play a little bit, blah, blah, and just a little bit here, we're going to add a third voice. So we actually have three at the same time now. Three notes. It's three notes at the same time. We require three voices, three human voices, or three different single note instruments to do this. So we have three voices. And what's funny is when you teach a fugue, this is one of the most fundamental. This is one of the most fundamental things. Like if you want to recognize a fugue with your ear, if a composer breaks everything down, stops everything, and then one part enters, and then a second part enters, copying that first part, and then the third part enters, you're like, probably listening to a fugue right now, right? Well, just so you know, all 24 of these fugues do that. It's one of the only categories with no exceptions. Almost every other category has like, well, yeah, in general, but, there's like a but. Well, there's a few here that don't do that. No. Enter one at a time is universal in the first book. None of the fugues start out with multiple notes at the same time. Now we can go through at this point and look at all 24 prelude and fugues and see how they enter one voice at a time. But if we did that for every category, this video would go on for like days. So you can check it if you want to. One of the core things I want you to learn is that the voices should enter one at a time. So when you see a fugue, look at anything in the first book and go, oh yeah, these enter one at a time. Kind of connect it with this idea. It's a little more complicated idea, is that when the voices enter, there is an order to how they enter with the keys. That the key scheme has to follow a certain sequence. And this is, again, one of these core elements you learn about the fugue. When you learn a fugue, you go, okay, whatever the first voice enters as, whatever key you're in, if you're in the key of C minor, if we stick with our first example, we're in the key of C minor, our second voice needs to enter in the key of G minor. So this example here, this is C minor. Second voice enters in G minor. We're very much in the key of G minor. So the key scheme is actually really simple to memorize. The key of 1, the key of 5, the key of 1, the key of 5, the key of 1, however much you need. If you have a 3-voice fugue, 1, 5, 1. If you have a 4-voice fugue, 1, 5, 1, 5. So the last one's on 5. If a 5-voice fugue, yeah, 1, 5, 1, 5, 1. But it's actually pretty simple. You just have that order. If you don't really understand keys that well, you can think of it from an interval point of view. Everything in the second voice should be shifted up a fifth, or it should be shifted down a fourth, which is the same difference. You start on C, up a fifth would be G, or down a fourth would also be G. But that is the order of the keys we are expecting. The initial entrance of the subject, which lots of what makes a fugue is that initial, we call the exposition. We'll get to more in this in a second, but the exposition where all the voices have a chance to enter one at a time, they should follow this key scheme when they enter. However, you have to be aware of the fact that there is something called an adjustment. Like when you go to the key of 5, there's often a moment where the first subject is ending in the key of 1. What are you going to do in that moment of overlap? There's going to be a moment where even sometimes the very first note of your subject did not transpose correctly. It'll be moved down a step to make it match the end of the subject. And in fact, this piece here has an adjustment. Right? So we have C to G. There's a fourth there. And the new key we get, it should be, that's actually correct. Now, if you heard this piece before, you think that sounds really gross. But I remember when I first learned this piece, my first experience in high school, I remember thinking like, that's the wrong note. That should be a D because it actually should be a D. But Bach has an adjustment as it kind of has a transitional period between the two keys. So as I talk about ones that fit the norm and ones that don't, it can be normal and have that adjustment at the beginning. It can happen at the end. It can be literally the first note. It can be within the first like 3 or 4 notes like this one. Just kind of knows you're looking at them. If you're like, well, Ryan said this one was normal, but it started on the wrong note. You have to look at kind of what key it gets into. Look at the majority of the notes. Are a majority of the notes in the key of 5? This one is a yes. This one follows what we expected. The key of 1, second subject key of 5, G minor. Third subject goes back to the key of 1. So this is actually perfectly normal. In fact, 21 are normal, but I want to show you an example of one that's not normal to kind of show you what not normal looks like. And our example comes from the very first fugue in the book. Bach literally started out the set with a bad fugue. I shouldn't say a bad fugue, but an unconventional fugue. In fact, this fugue is unconventional in many of the categories. So if you ever wondered why when you were doing theory classes or something, the fugue for this very famous prelude, you're like, well, they should just use the fugue for it, right? Like, why don't we study that fugue? The reason is your teachers would teach you all this stuff that wouldn't be true. It wouldn't apply to this piece. Now, this can kind of spawn a whole discussion of, well, there's exceptions. Like the first one's an exception. Can you really say 1-5-1-5 is standard? You can't, because as I just said, 21 out of 24 of the fugues do that. What that doesn't mean, though, is if you don't follow that key scheme, you're somehow wrong. Because even Bach, who definitely knew what he was doing, has 3 exceptions in this set. Like, he does it 3 times differently. So it's significant there's 3 exceptions, but also it's definitely the standard because he does it the same way 21 out of the 24 times. Let's talk about the first fugue here. So it starts out in the key of C, the key of 1. Then immediately the key of 5, G. Now we should go back to the key of 1, which would be the key of C. Bach keeps it in the key of G for the third subject. So he goes subject 1, number 2, number 3, keep it there. Number 4, shift back to the key of 1. Now, maybe some of you are very logical and you're thinking, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense because you can start in 1, go to 5, stay in 5, go back to 1. You end in the key you started in. And you're right. It actually does make a lot of sense, but it's not standard. It's not what he normally does, but it does make some degree of sense to go, okay, we're here in the key of C, key of G, stay in the key of G, back to the key of C. Now, fugues number 12 and 14, F minor and F sharp minor, also do something different with the order of keys. They basically do the key of 1, and then 5, and then 1, and then stay in 1. Again, accomplishing kind of the same goal of ending up in the key you started in, so you can just be there already. You don't have to like shift back to the key. But again, not following the standard. Those are the only exceptions to the 1-5-1-5. Now that we're talking about how subjects enter, let me draw your attention to a new category, which is they have to enter in the correct order. And this order can seem extremely confusing, I think, if you're trying to read about it. But once you hear it explained, it's actually really, really simple. So the rule is just this. When a subject enters, it needs to enter as an outer voice, which again can seem really vague and you think, what's that mean, as an outer voice? So let me explain it to you. It's pretty simple. Let's say you have a subject enter and you have a soprano, alto, tenor, bass. You need a 4-voice fugue. You can have the tenor go first. That's totally fine. Well, the next voice to enter can be anything. Anything you do will either be the lowest or the highest voice you've heard so far. So for example, if the tenor's gone and you have the bass enter, that's an outer voice. It's on the outside of the notes you're playing. Or you could have the alto command. That would be an outer voice. Or the soprano, no matter what you do next, is going to be an outer voice. However, you can't actually do the soprano next. Because if you go tenor, soprano, well, eventually you're going to have this alto come in, and that's going to be an inner voice. What that means for your playing is you're going to be down here playing, You're going to have a soprano up here, and eventually your new subject is going to be added in the middle. Now, why would that be bad? Just simple practical reasons. On the piano, it's hard to hear the inner voices. It's way easier to hear a new subject entering on the extremes, right? So if you start out here, then you add here, then you add here, and then you add here, it's always easy to hear the new voices. So simply put, if you have 4 voices, there's a lot of ways that you can do. You can do bass, tenor, alto, soprano. Everything you heard was higher one to the next. You could do it backwards. Start with soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Everything you heard was an outer voice. It was always the lowest voice. You could also do something like tenor, alto, bass, soprano, tenor, alto, soprano, bass. It doesn't matter as long as the voice you're hearing is now the highest or the lowest voice. Okay, so I'm going to use a really fun example for you of a 5-voice fugue. Here's the first voice. It's right here. So when you add the second voice, it has to be an outer voice. In this case, it's going to be higher. It's the highest of all the notes we hear right now. I'm going really fast right now to get through this. The next thing we hear is actually the highest again. It's the highest of all the notes we have right now. The subject. It takes a little bit first as we entered, and then we get this. That's the highest of all the notes we have right now. So everything we've heard so far has been a highest or lowest voice, and then we get the 5th voice up there on top. Is the highest of all the voices we've heard. But you could also do what the C minor fugue did, was here. You add the new one on top. Then you add the third one, you add it to the bottom. Almost all of them, in fact, 20 of them do the correct order. One of them is a 2-voice fugue, and the 2-voice fugue doesn't really have a correct order because it has to follow the convention. And 3 of them don't. So only 3 of all the fugues in the set don't do that. Every new voice is an outer voice. Now, the next 2 categories here are definitely separate, but they deal sort of with the same idea. So to understand them, I'm going to explain what you should expect next when listening to or reading through a fugue. So all of our voices, all 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, have now had a chance to state the subject. They've had a chance to play the subject, probably in different keys, jumping around in a certain order. But that's happened now. So once you get past that initial thing, the initial exposition, the expositions when all the subjects had a chance to say the melody at least once, now what Bach almost always will do is write an episode. And an episode is a moment where maybe there's a sequence, maybe you take the subject and fragment it and play a little partial, but you don't play the whole subject. And you have basically a rest period from the complexity of that exposition, from the complexity of all the fugues and the voices entering in their correct keys. And it's kind of like freedom for Bach. He could change keys. He could, again, take fragments of the subject and do it different ways. He could speed up the subject. There's typically going to be, we teach people to expect an exposition, and then eventually we're going to get a subject again in probably a new key. Eventually we're going to have that subject enter again, but there should be a little chill period in the middle. Like we just did all the work of the exposition. Now we have to kind of unwind a little bit, and eventually we're listening for a new subject entering. I'm going to use a fugue in C minor again as an example for this because it's such a clear example of what we expect from an episode. So we had the first melody, the first voice. Now we have 2 things going on at the same time. We'll get to this in a second. Eventually, we're going to have a third voice enter. You ready? So now all 3 voices are in, and all 3 voices had a chance to play the melody. And now we're kind of in like creativity mode. Bach can do a lot of things at this point, but we expect an episode. We expect somehow him to do something that is a little less structured with the melodies, and Bach gives us this. And you're like, oh, it's a melody. It's a melody, right? That sounded like our melody. But then he's kind of taking a fragment of the melody and sequencing it. He's going, it's not our original melody in the in its entirety. It's become fragment and sequence so it can move up and down. He's actually transposing to a new key. And Bach actually does this in 20 of the 24 fugues. So this is a pretty normal, standard thing to do, to have a little episode there. If you want to think of the benefits of having that episode, it helps you as the listener know where we are in the form. Like we're like, what was that, the third voice or the fourth voice? You're not quite sure. Bach goes on a little journey, plays like an episode for 10, 15 seconds, and then boom, a new subject enters. Let's say, for example, you were in minor, and now we get a major subject. We're like, oh, okay, so we've done our exposition. All the voices have entered. It helps you keep track of where you're at. However, there are some exceptions. I want to show you an exception here with fugue number 21. The subject goes... a very long subject, and the second voice enters. Notice there's actually an adjustment on the first note instead of he's changed the first note from a C to a B flat because he needs to keep that interval right with the last note of the melody up here. Another very long subject. 4 measures later, we get our third voice entering down here in the original key. Now check this out. At this moment, we should have a little celebration, and Bach should say, cool, we made it through all of our subjects. We had 3 subjects entering, but Bach chooses to immediately confuse us by playing this. This sounds like a 4th subject entering, and he doesn't stop, he just keeps going. But we know it's not a 4-voice fugue because Bach says, no, it's a 3-voice fugue. He literally tells us at the top. And also, there isn't actually 4 notes going on at the same time. There's only 3 notes going on at once, so it's just... Okay, so now kind of connected to that, but much easier to understand, at the end of these episodes, at some point in the future, now that we've gone past the exposition, we're expecting that subject to return pretty much intact, pretty much in its entirety, but in a new key. That's something we just kind of teach people when you're listening to a fugue. Look throughout the fugue and look for when that subject re-enters. In fact, this is a big mistake that's made amongst beginners. I don't want to say beginners because no fugues are really for beginners, but intermediate students who are playing fugues. And sometimes you can even hear the first 20, 30 seconds are interesting because you hear all the subjects entering. And then from that point forward, it's just notes. They're just banging away at notes on the piano. And you're just like, Bach sucks, right? And this happens sometimes. People think I hate Bach because they hear her play it that way. And maybe they did hear the subject enter at the beginning, but then it's just 2 or 4 pages of just notes because they haven't gone through and found every time that subject enters throughout the rest of the piece. Now, I love when C minor does this, and most of you have this in your ear array, so I want you to listen to how this works. At the beginning, as I said earlier, we get a little sequence. Then eventually we get this. That was our original melody. But instead of C minor, now we're in E flat. So that is one more thing to kind of add to your toolbox of what you expect a fugue to do. We should, after all the subjects have a chance to enter, eventually do subjects in their entirety in new keys. They don't always switch from major to minor, minor to major. So it's just reiterated again in minor. But that's something to listen for. And just so you know, all of them, all 24 do that. Okay, we have 2 more categories to deal with. But the fun part is these are the least consistent of the categories. There's still things that we often learn like fugue should do this, but it's fun because only 2/3 of them do. Both of them have 8 exceptions. 16 do it, 8 don't. So they're definitely not as standard, which I also find interesting because when you look at fugues of later composers, sometimes people say, well, they didn't write a very good fugue because they didn't know about this. But even Bach himself only did it 2/3, enough to be a standard, but only in 2/3 of his fugues in this book. So first up here, we're going to look at a final statement of the subject. So what we're going to define this as is somewhere near the end. Now I understand near the end can be relative depending on the length of the subject. Some subjects are like 1 measure long, some are 4 measures long. So it can depend on how close to the end it needs to be, how long it is. Also, it can depend on the length of the piece. Some of them are like 30 measure pieces, some are more like 4 pages long. We're looking for the original tune to come back in the original key, kind of like to set all things right again. Or like if you're listening to Mozart or Beethoven, we're in the key of G. And throughout the development section, it goes to like G minor, then you're in the key of B minor, then there's these crazy flats, and you're like, are we ever going to get home? And then finally, we get back to G somewhere, maybe in the sonata, if you know what I'm talking about. Same thing with this. We're kind of like, oh, we're in the key of C minor. Then we went to like G minor, C minor, G minor. Then we had episodes. Now we're like in the key of E flat. We're like straying away from C minor. Eventually, we want to get back and have a final statement, a strong statement in the original key. Now, because I've been picking on the first one so much and saying it's a bad fugue and showing all the reasons it doesn't fit convention, I want to use this as an example of one that does fit conventions. 4 measures from the end, in the bass, you do this. Oh, I'm realizing as I'm saying this is actually a bad fugue too. We get bad, you know what I mean. It doesn't follow convention. We get our tune here. And that is 4 measures from the end. That could literally be like our final statement of the original tune. But then when you're partway through that tune, actually, in fact, the final statement we get is kind of like in the key of F. So, man, fail again for the first fugue. Gotta like adjust it on my chart. So for an example, the more standard thing, looking at the second fugue, we get something like this. Bach being like, this is our melody. And in fact, this one literally ends on the subject. The very last note is the last note of the subject. It's not always like that. It's fine to get a final statement. Then there's like a 2 or 4 or 3, whatever measures at the end. It's just something different. But what you're really listening for is like a return to the original. Now, I told you that happened in 16 of the 24, but I guess the first one I was wrong on, so it's actually 15. Now, the next category is kind of weird and funky, but it is a very standard thing to learn about fugue. So you have your original statement. We're going to warp back to the beginning of the piece again and look at the original statement. You have the key of 1, the key of 5. We have to start the key of 1 again, but we have to get back to the key of 1. We're in the key of 5 right now, and Bach will typically add a little extra bridge to get back to the original key. So you might, for example, have the original melody take 3 measures. So this will also take 3 measures, but then often you'll notice this one starts 4 measures after this one started because Bach added a little bit of time to kind of shift back to the original key. It's actually kind of funny, but once you hear it, it's almost always there. In fact, I would say it's there about 2/3 of the time, if you know what I mean. We're in this key, C minor. We're going to get to the key of G minor, directly there, directly to the key of G minor. Now we should go, that would be the same time, but you hear how jarring that was because we just literally went way off. Now remember when we went to the second time, often Bach will do an adjustment, right? He will adjust a note here or there to make it sound right. He doesn't do that often when you go back to the original. So what he does instead is he makes this little bridge between the second and third subjects. Now we've transposed. The categories of kind of the rankings of how common things are. There's a third of these pieces don't do it. And I was kind of surprised to find that. I thought almost all of them did it, but 1/3 of them, Bach just kind of plows right into the second one. It depends, again, on the starting note. If the starting note makes sense with the ending note, and can you play in close proximity the ending note in the key of 5 with the starting note in the key of 1. So it's kind of a deep theory topic whether or not it happens, but there are definitely more times than I expected where Bach just doesn't do it. He doesn't add the extra time. He just goes right back to the first subject. So the third voice playing the original subject in the key of 1. All right, now if I could take your attention to the final category, this is more just for fun, but it is kind of informative in a weird way. I just called this normalness. The first fugue, now that we know that the one thing actually was not standard that I thought was standard, it is the weirdest of all the fugues. It would be the worst one to use as a teaching fugue. Now, not the worst one if you want to have a nuanced conversation about how, there's exceptions. This piece is really cool how it does exceptions. But if you're trying to like have a cookie cutter, clean fugue to be like, this is what fugue should do, you really shouldn't use the first one, because 4 out of my 8 categories, I'm including voices as a category just because they almost all have 3 or 4 voices. The first fugue has 4 weird things about it. Yes, they enter one voice at a time and it has 4 voices, but that's about all. It doesn't follow the right key scheme. It doesn't have an episode. It goes right into another subject after the original statement. There's no time, the bridge between the second and third one, because again, the keys actually aren't wrong, because the key scheme is wrong. That messes that up as well. It's a very kind of oddball fugue. But the second fugue, the reason, if you studied theory in college, the reason maybe you had to study this fugue was it does everything we want it to do. It doesn't even get into weird things like augmentation or like flipping over the melody. Some of the fugues do more sophisticated techniques that you often don't want to deal with in a beginner class in college. So the second fugue is great because it does everything we want it to do. It enters one at a time, the correct key scheme, you have the extra time, you have the episodes, you're going to get new keys, you're going to go to a major key even, we're going to have the final statement at the end. It just does everything. The thing I want you to notice about this kind of normalness chart is that the first half of fugues, except the first one's weird. But other than that, the first chunk of them are pretty normal. Either they have no exceptions, they do all 8 things, or they have one exception, right? But you get this chunk kind of getting near the end where you have kind of, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, where you're like, oh, one thing is weird, 2 things are weird, 2 things are weird, 3 things are weird. Like, they are actually weirder as you go along. Before we go, I'd really appreciate if you share this video with a few people, maybe some of your friends who are into music theory, or maybe even you're a college music theory teacher, and I know you're going to get more in depth in your class than I'm going to get like in a 30-minute video, but I'd really love if people just use this as like a rough intro for people who are kind of at the college level, who are ready to study it deeper, but just like big picture, here's all the big concepts we kind of expect. So I'd really love it if you could use it, share with your students, share with some friends, share with people who just want to know more about Bach and understand his fugues better. Thanks so much for watching. See you guys in the next video.